in the aftermath, however, was often overlooked, and one of the chief issues is the environmental fallout. Boiled down to the essentials, according to Michael Bowker, asbestos researcher, scientists are saying the EPA and other government officials literally overlooked the asbestos fallout around Ground Zero. In fact, we can go a little further than that. We know that they actually falsified statements and they made erroneous statements. The EPA used conflicting and outdated equipment in different parts of town while they simultaneously had people in hazmat suits cleaning up their own offices. Meanwhile, Christy Todd Whitman, the EPA administrator, said, quote, "There's no need for the general public to be concerned." Of course, you'll remember that long list of toxins I rattled off a moment ago, and I think that that list in and of itself is more than enough reason to be concerned. Specifically, even just with one of the toxins, asbestos is a known carcinogen, and once exposed to it, it leads to cancer and death, not to mention many of the other toxins that are found at Ground Zero. So our speakers here today are going to talk to you about specifically the issues in terms of the public health around Ground Zero. And we're going to begin the morning session today with Jeanette McKinley. And between each of the speakers, I'm going to come back up briefly and introduce each of the speakers respectfully so that you know who they are and can make the association very easily. The first speaker is Jeanette McKinley. Jeanette McKinley is a Ground Zero survivor. She lived near the towers during their collapse, and she's going to share her experiences with you and some of the slides that she has. So a round of applause, please, for Jeanette McKinley.
Do you want to get the computers? Can you see the slides okay? Okay, testing. Okay. Okay, thank you for including me. Is that, you want me to say something else? Okay, all right. Can everybody see this slide okay? No? Do we need to turn off the lights or? Thank you for including me. My presentation is very upfront and personal as a survivor. I was touched very deeply by everything. And I will put a human face on the fallout, even when he was talking about all of all the chemicals. I get nervous just thinking about it, actually. So later today, scientists are going to be examining this in greater detail, but my presentation is more visual and emotional, and it's more, I show an artistic response to what happened. I had been living back at Ground Zero, and this is a bronze plaque that's on the wall of Firehouse 10, and it's dedicated to those who perished and to those who carry on. And it was really nice to see that there's some kind of acknowledgement for those of us who do carry on, because it's not just about the people that died, it's about the people that have to live with this. I have mourned the dead, and I have joined the ranks of those who have the burden of trying to find the truth of 9/11. And it really has been a burden. It's not an easy road at all when you become involved in 9/11 truth. So as an artist, I will share my story with you through the artwork that I have created as I attempt to recover from post-traumatic stress, depression, and anger. It is a journey of art and activism. I'll show you my experience. Let's see. This is a view of the towers from outside my apartment. This was a photograph I had taken in the spring of 2001, and I show this just to give you a perspective of my involvement. And I'm going to also share with you, at the 6-month anniversary, I did an exhibition of Ikebana arrangements, which were a memorial that was called There But for the Grace of God. So as I go through my story, I'll be showing a photograph and then an artistic response. This is my artistic response. It's called In Memory, and it really just addresses, it was a memorial, and this was the highlight of the memorial. This is a photograph that my boyfriend Jim took from our apartment directly across the street. We chose to stay inside the apartment because my decision was based primarily on, I was scared of being trampled to death, because when you looked outside the window, there were so many people running and fleeing. I was more scared of getting caught in the middle of a panicking crowd. And Jim's decision was based on just a fascination of watching history unfold. Whenever any of our friends called us on the phone saying, "You've got to get out of there," he would say, "Come over here, we have front row seats. Why would we leave? We're watching this right out our window." So while all of this was going on, I actually was in the kitchen working on flower arrangements. I had complete faith that the firemen were going to put the fire out, that the fire was going to be contained, and I really didn't want to panic. So I was actually working on flower arrangements while the towers were burning as a way to calm myself. Jim's vigilance at watching out our windows paid off. He actually saw the tower starting to come down, and as he described it, a waterfall of dust, and just said, "Get out of here, the building is coming down." We were able to make it just to our front door of the apartment, and that cloud that you see racing down the street actually just came racing in our apartment, and our whole apartment, our windows blew in, and our apartment was covered with dust and debris, and we really didn't know whether we were going to be able to get out, because day really became night, and reality really became a nightmare. And this is my response when I did my exhibition. This is called 10 Seconds in September. This is what it instantly looked like out our window. So this was my viewpoint. Anyway, let's see. This is the front of my building. Our windows blew in. You can see that the windows were blown in. Let's see. Jim knew that we needed to have wet towels, and so he immediately started saying, "Get a wet towel." Anyway, I wrapped my head in a wet towel. This photograph is taken about 4 blocks away. But I think the interesting thing about this photograph, this is also taken about noontime, about 4 blocks away. And you can still see the dust in the air. The dust didn't just settle. The dust literally for the whole day just hung in the air. And it was just in the air. It just wouldn't go away, and it's actually really never gone away for me. But the dust also had a spiritual quality. When you were walking through the dust, breathing the dust, you almost could feel the spirits of the people who had perished. And to this day, I feel motivated by that's the spirit of those people from the dust that I breathed in, and this is what I was going through. This was an art piece I did. This was dust that I had collected when I was cleaning my belongings. At one point, I had a pile of dust, and I later, for my exhibition, did this piece is called All That Remains. And I just wanted to show respect for the dust. I've always had great respect for the dust. This is when I was allowed back in after 10 days to try to pick up personal belongings. Everything was covered with dust. You had a police escort and to pick up belongings. And as you'll see, I have no mask. We were told over and over again on the radio and the newspapers by Christy Todd Whitman, without question, just go in. And so I actually went back to my apartment about 16 times. So in addition to the initial exposure to the dust, I had a lot of experience just trying to, get my belongings. This is a picture of the bed. You can see the amount of dust that came in. This was when Tower 2 collapsed. I show this picture because we had to sign release forms in the summer of 2002 for the EPA to come in and do a cleaning of our apartment. And I have a couple of photographs here. Here we are, 4C. But these are the people from EPA. They initially told us no problem going in the apartment. And then when the EPA decided to come in the apartment, they never even would step like 1 inch in the door without suits and masks and release forms. So the public was being treated one way, and the EPA, they were treating themselves another way. It's just more evidence that it was obvious that they knew about the toxicity of the dust. This is an image of the first arrangement that I did when we were staying in the hotel. It was right after 9/11. There was such a surge of patriotism. I really felt that patriotism, and this was my first memorial when I just wanted to cheer up the hotel room, so I put this image together. But that patriotism really brought a sense of anger, and at that point I really wanted to kill the terrorists. I wanted to join the army, actually. I was actually speaking of joining the army because I just needed to have some kind of outlet for my revenge. This is a piece I did for an art show called Desire to Kill. And as you can see, I have Bin Laden in the site. And I think this was a starting point for a lot of people, like you just needed to do something. Anyway, as I healed, I began to educate myself by going to lectures and reading books, trying to learn about American foreign policy, just so I could come to grips and try to understand what was going on with the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and also the war of, what they call the war on terror. This was a piece I did when I started researching the political angles. It's called High Cost of Oil, and it's a coffin flag on top of the oil cans. This is also a piece called Uranium Over Iraq. And I followed the 9/11 Commission hearings, and upon the release of the 9/11 Commission report, I became an activist when the Commission report was released because they wouldn't give us any information. There was no accountability. There was also all the unanswered questions are literally behind a brick wall, and this card expresses it's kind of like hitting your head against a brick wall too. The information is behind a brick wall, and trying to get to it is like beating your head against the wall. But I became active. I put on an event called Question 9/11. This was earlier this year at the Grand Lake Theater. And it's really when I just started to realize that, as a citizen, I had a responsibility to speak out and try to get people involved. And this was the poster that we created where I'm trying to just and get people to question 9/11. And this is the last piece I did. I did this for the 5th anniversary, and it's really inspired by Dr. Jones and the conclusions that he's come up with. This is the building burning, 9/11 bottom line, explosives in building. And I would like to conclude my presentation with a 9/11 prayer that was given to me on the 5th anniversary by activist Mia Hamill. May 9/11 truth be properly investigated and widely publicized, and may this contribute to greater justice, liberty, prosperity, and peace for all people around the world. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Jenna Orkin from the World Trade Center Environmental Organization, and has also had works published at Counterpunch and From the Wilderness. So please welcome Jenna.
Is this... I'm not a scientist. Is that... How do you do it? All right. This paper is about how science was used to perpetrate lies after 9/11, a cautionary tale for the approaching peak oil disaster. September 11th was, among other things, a big bang that signaled the birth of a new universe. As this new universe unfolds, we're learning that it operates under laws which are antithetical to the ideals we grew up with. Human life is no longer sacred. Democratic ideals are not upheld, and nor are any other ideals, certainly not those of health or compassion. The new universe upholds pragmatism above all else, even to the point of cynicism. For what is at stake now, given the arrival of peak oil and the waning of water and other resources, is survival. Towards that end, the powers that be will tolerate all means necessary. Whose survival? Not America's, nor even the world's, but their own. This new attitude of blatant indifference to human health, suffering, and life itself first manifested itself in the environmental disaster of 9/11, which began when the Twin Towers and the other 5 buildings at Ground Zero collapsed, and the fires ignited by the 2 planes burned and smoldered for 3 months, releasing record levels of some of the most toxic and carcinogenic substances that flesh is heir to. The World Trade Center was a city with its own zip code. When it fell, hundreds of tons of asbestos were pulverized to particles of an unusually small size, which some scientists believe are especially dangerous to human health, and carried to Brooklyn and beyond. The towers also contained 50,000 computers, each made with approximately 4 pounds of lead, and tens of thousands of fluorescent light bulbs, each 4-foot bulb containing approximately 41 milligrams of mercury. Dioxin reached record levels. The smoke detectors contained radioactive americium-241. PCBs in the dust reached the level of drain cleaner. A month after the disaster, Dr. Thomas Cahill of UC Davis found very and ultrafine particles that were the highest he'd recorded of 7,000 samples taken around the world, including at the burning Kuwaiti oil fields. And yet EPA Administrator Christy Todd Whitman told the people within several days, told the people of New York, good news, the air is safe to breathe. I should disclose that I am one of 12 original plaintiffs in a class action lawsuit against Whitman and the EPA. Whitman's announcement, she has maintained ever since, was based on the best science available at the time. Also ever since, science has been used in the service of lies and the economy at the expense of human life. How is this possible? Science is objective. Instruments and facts don't lie. It depends on who's using the instruments and what axe they're grinding. It depends on what facts are told, and more pointedly, on what facts are left out. This is not the conference in which to discuss the fact that when Whitman told the people of New York the air was safe to breathe, not only did EPA lack the data to support that statement, they actually had data that contradicted it. And nor is this the conference to go into Whitman's potentially felonious conflict of interest in speaking about the World Trade Center at all when she owned shares of Port Authority stock and had sworn in her oath of office to recuse herself from cases in which she had a personal stake. This is a conference about science, so we will look at how science was used to promote the lies perpetrated by the EPA and the White House Council on Environmental Quality, which edited at least one of EPA's press releases, replacing cautionary statements about asbestos with reassurances. The technique was simple: make a mockery of science. Perform scientific tests, but use the wrong equipment in the wrong places, the wrong way. The technique was put into effect immediately when EPA conducted its initial tests for asbestos. First of all, query why they focused so exclusively on asbestos. There were over 2,000 contaminants released in the disaster, some of which had never before existed. But even if this autistic focus on asbestos had been plausible, how could EPA's tests have come up with the wrong results? Dr. Kate Jenkins, an EPA whistleblower, told the St. Louis Post-Dispatch that EPA had used 20-year-old instruments to conduct their tests. For every fiber of asbestos that EPA found, independent contractors found 9. The risk of cancer from the asbestos alone could be 1 person in 10. EPA's Region 8 out west offered Region 2 in New York up-to-date equipment that they could summon with the snap of the fingers from New Jersey. Region 2's William Mushinski said, quote, "We don't want you fucking cowboys here." Later, a task force was set up to investigate what had gone wrong with Region 2's response to 9/11. Unfortunately, the task force was headed by Mushinski. Also, EPA used a 1% standard for asbestos in the dust, but this standard was established for intact materials like water pipes. The fear was if a tiny piece of the water pipe broke off and contained asbestos, then someone might inhale it and that would be dangerous. EPA applied this 1% standard to Lower Manhattan, where none of the material was intact, all of it had been pulverized, all of it could be inhaled, and there were tons of it. Since 9/11, EPA has been nothing if not consistent. In addition to using out-of-date equipment, they have routinely advocated the wrong tests. For instance, they advocated a wipe test for PAHs, which are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, to be used on soft surfaces, whereas the test was intended exclusively for hard surfaces, and it makes a big difference. They resisted testing on horizontal surfaces, dust falls down onto horizontal surfaces, or in corners where dust was likely to be found, favoring vertical surfaces and countertops that had been frequently cleaned. They fought the use of ultrasonication, a sensitive test for asbestos, which they themselves had developed. They based their determination of whether an area was contaminated on a visual inspection, as though the naked eye were a microscope. In other words, they would send their workers into your building. The workers would take a look around, say, "Looks clean to me." That was it. In some cases, this visual inspection was performed, and I kid you not, from an airplane. And how did they determine whether the dust they found was World Trade Center dust? In one building, they asserted, "That's not World Trade Center dust. World Trade Center dust is gray and gritty." In another, "That's not World Trade Center dust. World Trade Center dust is brown and fluffy." Other abuses of science included EPA's writing off of deposits of magnesium on the grounds that it's a nutrient. If only we had known we were supposed to eat World Trade Center dust instead of breathing it. Keep talking. We're testing this. How's it going? It's better. Okay. It was better before. If only we'd known we were supposed to eat World Trade Center dust instead of breathing it, perhaps everything would have turned out all right, although I doubt it. People who ingested World Trade Center dust now suffer gastrointestinal as well as respiratory and other illnesses. And then there was the issue of spikes. When my son was 12, he wanted to be a magician. As he underwent his sorcerer's apprenticeship, I learned some tricks of the trade. Rule number 1, when you're doing your sleight of hand, you say, "Look over there." Well, EPA and the other authorities had also learned this trick, and thus they dismissed high levels as spikes or outliers, thereby shoving unpleasant data under the carpet. A corollary of this practice was averaging, in which the spikes were averaged out over a lifetime or over a large area and thus made to disappear. However, the human body doesn't do that. When the lungs are exposed to too much water, you drown. When someone overdoses on drugs, the human body doesn't say, "I'm going to average this out over a lifetime," you die of an overdose. Dr. Kate Jenkins has written several memos detailing other EPA lies. The latest is subtitled, "Cover-Up, Corrosive Alkalinity of World Trade Center Dust by EPA, OSHA, and NYC. Falsification of the health implications of the alkaline pH data, fraudulent reporting of pH levels for smallest World Trade Center dust particles." She shows how the Agency for Toxic Substances Disease Registry and New York City relied on outdated texts, which, for instance, tolerated lead levels 60 times as high as those now considered safe. And she provides evidence of their lying and criminal malpractice. EPA's execution of tests and cleanup was as shoddy as their research. In their so-called cleanup of 2002, residents found them performing air tests with the fan turned off or facing the wrong direction. Since 9/11, there have been several blue-ribbon scientific panels which have convened to consult with EPA on next steps. At the first one, EPA neglected to tell the panel that the document on which they were supposedly conducting peer review was already being implemented downtown. The panel learned this from community members who were allowed to speak for 3 frantic minutes each in public sessions. The final panel, which lasted almost 2 years, spent much of that time on a quixotic quest for a World Trade Center fingerprint or signature, as though it were the fountain of youth or the alchemical formula for gold. For once the fingerprint was found, that would be it. If you had it, you had World Trade Center dust, and they'd give you a cleanup, however bogus. If you didn't have it, you didn't. You could get on with your life. However, a couple of us have always maintained that either metaphor was a snare. The World Trade Center was not a person. It didn't have a fingerprint or signature. Its contents were not stirred into a homogeneous blend in that great mixing bowl in the sky along with 2 eggs. The more than 2,000 contaminants released were spread unevenly according to their weights and other properties, as well as the wind conditions of the moment. But the quest for the ever-elusive fingerprint went on. First it was asbestos, then gypsum with a soupçon of, if I remember, man-made vitreous fibers and a very specific pH. And then it was slag wool, because in the dozen or so samples that one study had collected close to the site, slag wool, which is a component of glass, had been uniformly present. One must ask, and one did, if a fingerprint or signature is unique and irrefutable, why did the World Trade Center fingerprint or signature keep changing? One must also ask, and many did, if the signature is determined to be a particular assortment of contaminants, what do we do about all the rest? Nobody ever answered that, because the panel dissolved when an independent panel, couching their dismay in polite science speak, effectively accused the whole process of fraud. Let's go back or maybe I should not condemn the whole process. They accused EPA of fraud. Let's go back to the assertion at the beginning of this talk that 9/11 was a watershed moment when the laws and precedents that we previously relied on all got turned on their heads. In the case of environmental disasters, what that means is this. Before 9/11, in the event of a release of toxic contaminants, EPA did representative testing in concentric circles to determine the path of contamination. They might find that a certain contaminant had gone a mile in this direction and a block in another, but it was legitimate as a method, and in the World Trade Center case, they didn't do it. Instead, 9/11 set a new precedent for testing and cleanup. The quick and dirty method, a lick and a promise in order to get back to work ASAP. The cleanup standard that they used in Lower Manhattan, which was a 1 in 10,000 cancer risk, exposed residents to 100 times the cancer risk of previous standards. This is serving as a precedent for the new standards that they plan to implement in the event of a dirty bomb. Anti-nuclear activists have found that 100 times the usual level of radiation will be tolerated. Why? Just as the Inspector General's report of 2003 found that the White House Council on Environmental Quality edited EPA's press releases out of the need to reopen Wall Street, EPA has matter-of-factly stated that if the area affected by a dirty bomb is important to the economy, human health will be sacrificed. Economic hubs tend to be highly populated, so the more people who are likely to be exposed to radiation because a particular site is important to the economy, the greater will be the haste to reopen it. What lessons can we learn from the environmental disaster of 9/11? The answer to this is the reason that I felt it important to speak at this conference. What we can learn from the environmental disaster of 9/11 is that it is up to us to educate ourselves. We cannot trust the powers that be, the suits. We cannot bow to their supposed greater authority. To do that, knowing what we know, is to put our collective head in the sand and abdicate responsibility. This lesson is of enormous importance as peak oil takes over the world, for the same scenario is playing out in this new arena. First, the powers that be tell us there is no problem. And then when the elephant in the living room grows too large, they acknowledge the problem, but they say, look over there. And they point to the tar sands in Alberta or to ethanol. But will these solutions really work? Just as after 9/11 it was necessary for the community, and we were non-scientists, to teach themselves enough science to recognize lies, in order to understand what's really happening with peak oil, it is necessary to do the math. It isn't hard math. It's about 6th grade level, if that's when you study ratios. Is that when you study ratios? This evening, we'll talk about how, when you actually do the math for the supposed solutions to peak oil, the numbers don't add up. After 9/11, the people of Lower Manhattan were beguiled by the government, like children by the Pied Piper, to return to an area which every instinct told them was poisonous. They went back blinded by wishful thinking because they wanted to go home, by ambition because Lower Manhattan was where their jobs were, and by arrogance, writing off the naysayers as fringy eccentrics because it is comforting to feel superior. Some of these people boasted impressive achievements, advanced degrees, and high IQs, but their achievements got in the way of their ability to perceive the truth. They were not open to the opinions of those who did not represent an agency or have some sort of good housekeeping seal of approval. What we can also learn from the environmental disaster of 9/11 is that 8 million Frenchmen can be wrong. The people who recognized early on how egregiously the government was lying were a small minority. We had cooties. We were the kids that the cool crowd looked down on, but believe me, we would rather have been wrong. If any good is to come out of the environmental disaster of 9/11, it is as an inoculation against even greater disasters in the future. Those disasters will be both unique and universal. They will repeat history, not necessarily in their superficial details, for instance, record levels of contaminants, but in their structure, lies, ass covering, media complicity or gullibility, and truth coming from unexpected quarters. Those who lived through the lies and the terrible consequences of the environmental disaster of 9/11 must learn truth does not always come dressed with the trappings of authority or even wear a suit. And the smarter and more educated we are, the more we must be on guard against arrogance. We must keep an open mind, listen even to those from out in left field, and educate ourselves. Our lives depend on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna Orkin. The third speaker. The third speaker for today in the morning session is asbestos litigation attorney Nate Mudd from Simmons Cooper Law Firm in Illinois. And he's with us today to talk about specifically the issues of asbestos and health contamination, because as we've just heard, it was a very, very serious and it's an ongoing problem from ground zero survivors and first responders alike. So please welcome Nate Mudd.
Thank you, Mickey, and thank you everybody for coming today. On the way here, I had several people ask me, what am I doing in San Francisco? Am I enjoying myself? Why are you here? And I told them, I'm an asbestos attorney. I represent people who are sick due to no fault of their own because they were exposed to asbestos. And most of those people look at me and say, well, wasn't asbestos banned 30 years ago? How do you have a job? Well, the fact is asbestos was never banned. It should have been banned. And asbestos is in a lot of our buildings that are still standing today. And anytime something as tragic as the World Trade Center collapse or any other building, anytime another building is destroyed or torn down, asbestos is released into the environment. Another reason I actually have a job is because there was a vast conspiracy. I'm sorry, I'm walking away from the mic like a lawyer. Please bear with me. There was a vast conspiracy between corporations and insurance companies to hide the dangers of asbestos. Companies knew from the 1920s on that asbestos was killing their workers and killing the people that were working with the asbestos. What did they do about it? They performed medical tests. They spent a lot of money to have tests done to determine whether or not asbestos really did cause cancer, really did cause a specific type of cancer called mesothelioma. And when they got the results of those tests, they changed them. They changed the results to say, no, asbestos does not cause cancer. You can work with it safely. And they published those results in medical journals, which led thousands, if not millions of people to work with asbestos much longer than they ever should have. In a nutshell, that's why I'm employed today. The World Trade Center collapse, unfortunately, is a very similar situation. We know that asbestos was in the building. We know that people were exposed to asbestos because of the collapse and because of the failures to properly clean up and test. The reason why it's more similar to the litigation that I do, though, is because of the cover-up. The EPA knew about the asbestos. The EPA assured people that being in the area was safe. They assured the first responders that they were safe, while the whole time their own employees had on spacesuits and masks that were approved for use with asbestos. Perhaps I should discuss exactly what is asbestos. I know that's somewhat of a boring topic, but just to give you all a background on what asbestos is and how it causes disease. There are three basic types of asbestos. There's amosite, crucidolite, and chrysotile. There's a fourth type of asbestos that wasn't intended for commercial use, that actually contaminated vermiculite that was mined in Libby, Montana. We do know from sales records and from newspaper articles that there were at least 100,000 80-pound bags of W.R. Grace vermiculite in the World Trade Centers. The doctors, industrial hygienists, pathologists, everyone agrees, whether they're on my side as a plaintiff's attorney or on the defense side, that all of these forms of asbestos cause disease. All of them cause asbestosis, all of them cause cancer, all of them cause mesothelioma. The federal government, however, has set a standard for asbestos, like they do for a lot of known carcinogenic materials, that allows people to work with it. That standard is 0.01 fibers per cubic centimeter. At that level that is safe, according to our government, you can't see it. I could have a cloud of asbestos at a dangerous level around my head right now, and none of you would know, and I would not know. You saw the pictures that Jeanette had. It looked like she was standing in a couple inches of dust. There was asbestos in that dust. If it was possible for me to pick one piece of asbestos up and drop it from my hand, the scientists say that it could take as many as 8 hours for that fiber to hit the ground. Now imagine that huge cloud. I know you can all picture it in your mind. Jeanette brought that back to us in her speech. Imagine that huge cloud and how high that dust cloud was and how many hours it took that dust to settle. And then imagine all of the safety crews rushing into the scene, all the footsteps, all the tire tracks, again riling up that dust, and it again settles very, very slowly. Each time someone stirs up the dust, it's another exposure. What did the EPA do? They didn't do enough. That's for sure. Before I get into actually what they did, though, I don't want you to just take my word for it that asbestos was in the World Trade Center. We do have proof. We have proof through newspaper articles back in the 60s and 70s when the World Trade Center was being built. In 1971, the city of New York banned the use of spray insulation in buildings such as the World Trade Center. At that time, the construction of the World Trade Center stopped so they could find an alternative type of insulation to use in the building. We know through, and I don't know if I brought it, it might be. I've got an article from Asbestos Magazine from 1981 that has a beautiful picture of the Twin Towers that touts that when you want to save lives, use asbestos. We've got the sales records from W.R. Grace that I mentioned earlier. Records exist. Firms like mine create huge depositories of records, mostly because the companies that manufactured asbestos destroyed their records. So when we get our hands on them, we share them with everyone we know and create depositories for them. We also know because the Port Authority sued. They sued to get the asbestos taken out. They tried to sue the manufacturers of the asbestos. That was thrown out of court, but not because it wasn't asbestos. It was on other legal grounds that don't even interest me at this point. And then finally, we know through the dust counts. The dust counts that were done, as mentioned earlier by Ms. Orkin, many of them showed levels of asbestos less than 0.0003. It's very interesting that the levels would be that low, knowing all of the asbestos that was in those buildings. Other than the spray insulation, I failed to mention floor tile, ceiling tile, drywall joint compounds, any plasters that went in, given the time that those buildings were built, would all have had asbestos in them. So when the buildings collapsed, all of that asbestos was released. It all became friable, and everyone around there breathed it. Back to the dust counts. The dust counts that the EPA did, as mentioned before, were done with outdated microscopes. You could perhaps go out into the hallway there and find a microscope that would be better than what the EPA chose to use in examining the dust. I equate that to, my wife's back here and we have young children. I equate what the EPA did in looking for asbestos with me playing hide-and-go-seek with my 2-year-old. You're looking, but you really don't want to find. And hide-and-go-seek, that's fun. In real life, that kills people. So what was the EPA's response? After testing inappropriately, they told people that do I keep moving around too much, Mickey? I apologize. I'm a swayer. If I can't walk, I sway. Yeah. They didn't properly warn people. They told people it was safe. They lied or knowingly misled the public that they could be around the dust and that they would be safe. They told people that they could clean it up with a wet rag while in their own offices they were cleaning it up with HEPA filters. They knew or should have known that the people who lived around the area were being exposed to dangerous levels. They knew or should have known that the first responders were being exposed to dangerous levels. And they knew or should have known that those that they let back into the ground zero area on September 18th, I believe. Okay. I believe it opened for business around September 18th, didn't it? We know through tests that those people shouldn't have been in there and they were being exposed to high levels of asbestos. Now, how do we know that? It's already been said that this dust had been pulverized so much that the microscopes couldn't count the asbestos. That's a real problem in counting asbestos. The best way to do it after you've breathed it is to wait until a person dies and to take tissue from their lungs and do a fiber burden study. That's obviously not possible to do on everybody that was around there. Once people are diagnosed with cancer and mesothelioma and asbestos, that will be done by pathologists and by their doctors. And then we'll really know the amount of asbestos that was in those buildings. The problem, as also mentioned before, with that pulverized asbestos is it was so small that it's hard to get out of the lungs. We have in our bodies what's called a mucociliary elevator. That's easy for me to say. It's a mechanism by which we expel dusts and other things from our lungs and from our digestive tract. These fibers are so small that the mucociliary elevator does not necessarily work on them. They stay in their lungs and they create cancers faster and they become more dangerous. Now, I've mentioned only asbestos. It is thought that the mixture of all these other toxins that you've heard along with the asbestos is actually making the asbestos more dangerous than it would be by itself. So we've got the added problem of extra dust, extra toxins, extra effort for our lungs to expel all those dusts, and the asbestos stays in. I did find it in my notes. Workers were allowed back into the area on September 17th, so I was a day off. In the 5 days before September 17th, dust studies were done by several independent companies or independent government agencies. It's interesting that every one of those studies showed higher levels of asbestos than all of the EPA tests. The tests I found most interesting were done by the New York Department of Environmental Protection. They tested 38 samples within the 5 days before they allowed people to re-enter the ground zero area. Most of those tests that they took, most of the samples they took, the machines were so clouded with dust that they couldn't even count them. Of the ones that they could count using the higher magnification microscopes and the proper equipment, 40% of those showed dangerously high levels of asbestos. And those weren't right on the pile. Those were several blocks away. In fact, the highest count of 150 fibers per square meter was found 7 blocks from ground zero. Now, I don't know personally how much farther they tested either way, but at 7 blocks away, they found 157 fibers per square meter. The safe level, according to our government, is 70 fibers per square meter. Although if you dig deeply into the EPA asbestos standards, you will find in small print that they agree that there is no safe level of asbestos exposure. So what do we have? We have 7 blocks away. We have over double the safe level of exposure that is not safe. And at the same time, we have Christy Todd Whitman making the statement, I'm proud to tell everybody, I'm proud to inform everyone that their air is safe to breathe and their water is safe to drink. And they sent everybody back. They sent Miss Orkin's son back to high school 4 blocks north of the World Trade Center, knowing that the asbestos levels were too high, knowing that the air wasn't safe to breathe. Of course, their reasoning was if we didn't go back, the terrorists have won. In reality, what the EPA is doing is making sure the terrorists won a lot more than they thought they did, because all these exposures are going to create death. All these exposures are going to create cancers and mesotheliomas. Where'd Mickey go? How am I doing on time, Mickey? All right. Lawyers often tend to talk too much also. Luckily, the worst of the asbestos cancers are extremely rare. There are going to be several people who lose that lottery, though. Because of the toxicity of those dusts, it's assured that there are going to be cancers, there are going to be mesotheliomas. And what can those people who get sick do? There have actually been some funds set up to compensate those victims, to help with their treatment, to help with their recovery if it's possible to recover. However, the things that have been set up for those people really aren't helping anyone, as Jeanette could probably attest to. The Federal Victims Compensation Fund was set up to help those devastated by 9/11. The big problem with that compensation fund is if you haven't filed a claim by December of 2003, you have no claim. Also in that compensation fund, if you can't prove that you were exposed and got sick due to your work within 96 hours of the collapse, you don't have a claim. We also have what's called the FAIR Act. Our government likes to name legislation in interesting ways. The FAIR Act is the Fairness in Asbestos Injury Resolution Act. This was an act set up to help all of those that were exposed to asbestos and compensate all of them for their disease. The act would cover those people that were exposed in the Navy, those people that were exposed at W.R. Grace and Libby, those people who just lived by Libby, Montana and were exposed. What the bill did not do was cover anybody that would have gotten sick through the World Trade Center dust. They were specifically excluded from the bill because it would have bankrupted the bill. Luckily, that bill did not pass this last year, and hopefully it won't rear its head again due to the happenings of last week. That remains to be seen. There is some good news as far as treatment is concerned. And in an attempt to be fair and balanced, despite my position, I would like to point out that a Democrat and a Republican, Representatives Maloney and Fasella, have recently pushed federal legislation to reopen the September 11th Victim Fund It would remove the arbitrary December 2003 deadline for filing a claim, and it would remove the arbitrary deadline of 96 hours from the time of the attacks for exposure. I do urge you to contact any of your representatives if you're not from here, and if you're from here, urging them to back this legislation to help the people that were injured in the attacks and in the cleanup and in the surrounding and in the months after the attacks. There are some other resources for people who live in New York City, mostly monitoring, but at the conference like this, that really isn't necessary to speak about. I believe Mickey's going to open this up to questioning. I can answer some more specific questions if anyone has them. And are Jenna and Jeanette coming up, or would you like us all to sit down? But in conclusion, the only thing I could say, the only thing I have left to say about asbestos is ask questions and don't be afraid to be vigilant. Thank you all for being here.
At this point, we'd like to open up for questions for any three of the panelists. So how we're going to do this, since we having a small audio issue, but that'll be rectified hopefully by the rest of the sessions. Like it if you would all, anybody who has a question, you can just please raise your hand and speak fairly loudly your question, and then I'll try to repeat it into the mic, and then I'll give the mic to one of the respective speakers. So we'll see how that goes. Yes.
This is from Ms. Orkin. Is New York University being subpoenaed for the lawsuit? And the reason I asked, my daughter was living in New York University student housing on Water Street, just a few blocks from the Trade Center. And NYU did not allow the students to return for about 3 weeks, and they had everything completely cleaned to the dust. So they appear to have known something that Christy Todd Whitmer wasn't telling the other residents of that area.
I wouldn't speak about the litigation I'm involved in. As far as I know, I know nothing about a subpoena of NYU. I do know that Dr. George Thurston of NYU was one of the people who told everybody it was fine, because he came to Stuyvesant High School, and I had Juan Gonzalez's article, which had just been published, called Toxic Zone. That was the first major piece of media that told the truth. And I held up this, they were all telling everybody, don't worry, we're back in the building, isn't that great? So I showed this article, what about these levels? And Thurston said, put that away, that's yellow journalism. Those levels are all spikes. That's what that speech referred to. So he's implicated. And Dr. Kate Jenkins speaks at great length about that in her memo. I don't know the specific status of NYU, but I don't know about a subpoena.
Mickey invited me to this conference, and I merely handed over the pamphlet that Mickey sent me and said, can I go? They didn't ask too many questions about the conference and who was speaking. I don't think they really care about making anybody angry. We're there for the victims. We're there for the people that get sick. And if I end up on some other government watch list, then that's fine too. What was the first question? I mentioned fair and balanced earlier, and your question, I can't answer that question. That's for some of these people here that are smarter than me, these physicists and the doctors that are here. However, I can tell you that a reporter with Fox News did report that because there wasn't enough asbestos in the buildings is why they collapsed.
Right here in the front.
In terms of the chemical testing or whatever testing that was done by the EPA, did they tend to investigate single contaminants, or did they take into effect their additive effects when they...
That's an excellent question, and Nate alluded to it. They emphatically did not take into account additive and synergistic effects. It's one of the things that we've been arguing with them about and bringing up over and over again for the last 5 years. Very little is known about synergy, and that's their excuse for not looking into it. But we do know certain things. For instance, with asbestos and smoking, we know that if you do both, if you're exposed to asbestos and you're a smoker, okay, is the risk twice as bad of getting cancer? No, it's 80 or 90 times as bad. That's, one aspect of synergy that's known, and it's yet another thing that's being shoved under the carpet.
Real quick, Mickey, I'm sorry. And just to add to that, I neglected to say in my speech that normally doctors all agree somewhere around 10 to 15 years is the latency period for asbestos-related diseases. That you're exposed to them and you don't get disease for another 10 or 15 years, sometimes 20, sometimes 50 years. What the doctors are looking at now are a recent death of one of the workers in the area of mesothelioma after 5 years from the collapse of the World Trade Center that has been attributed to the World Trade Center death, his death has been attributed to the World Trade Center collapse and the dust because of all the synergistic effects of the mixed dust.
I have a question for everybody. Jeanette, and these are short. Jeanette, where do you live now, and what happened to your building?
Well, the building was renovated in 2002. The power was out until the summer of 2002. It was when they renovated my building, they actually had to take up the hardwood floors because they were going to never get the dust out. They had to take the wallpaper off the wall. They had to take the carpet up. All new appliances, new refrigerator, new everything. It was just because the owners of my building I was renting knew that it was impossible to clean. The dust was so invasive. I came to California after 5 weeks, and I stayed here until the summer of 2005. And I actually moved back into that same apartment for a year and a half and just moved back to California about 10 days ago. I have a home here in Oakland. So it was necessary for me to go back in order to move away again because it was such a traumatic experience. I really had to go back in order to reclaim my spirit, really, is what I did. So, but the construction noise, they've started construction now, and it's absolutely impossible to live there. And it was toxic on every level for me. It was toxic physically, it was toxic mentally and emotionally. And so now I'm back in the Bay Area, which is really my home. I had just been living in New York for 4 years.
Hold on. Sorry, we're gonna have to we have to limit it to one question per person, and because we have so many people here that want to ask questions. Yeah, over here.
This question is for you indicated there were 3 types of.
Could you please project if you could?
3 types of asbestos. You indicated andesite, peroxidolite, and there was a 3rd type. Could you reiterate that?
Chrysotile. Chrysotile, C-H-R-Y-S. And I also, going third there, I had things I wanted to say that I didn't say because of what the other speaker said, but I also forgot some things that I think are very important. There is one OSHA study that I looked at that, of course, wasn't reported to the public that found that the dust that they studied right on the rubble pile had as much as 50% chrysotile in it.
Yeah, you go.
Yeah, I had a question for all 3. One of the limiting factors of these sorts of meetings is that you're somewhat preaching to the choir. We're all interested. And generally speaking, a lot of us are just regular question is, have you done some of these presentations to police, fire, and military audiences? Because I have a feeling that those three audiences, especially the fire department, would respond very well to a citizen such as Jeanette in a very gentle way, sharing her experiences, as well as a scientist like Jenna, as well as a lawyer. So, and a board citizen as well as a lawyer. But is that something that you guys see opportunity with?
We're working with Ground Zero workers. They're very aware by now. And, you know, one doesn't like to generalize, but there's we're in tandem right now. I want to add something to what Nate said about Carolyn Maloney's bill, which Vito Fossella signed on to. There's another bill, which is superb, by Congressman Nadler, which would involve something like the Medicare system to cover absolutely everybody. And, you know, that's an ideal bill. Unlikely to, well, I won't say that. It's a wonderful bill. Got to support that.
Well, I'll just speak briefly. I found that even talking about 9/11 is like taboo. And especially when I went back to New York, it's like walking on eggshells. You know, people that I experienced, it's not an open and welcome subject. I mean, you're really, anyway, it's difficult. I don't think, anyway, I'm just lucky to do as much talking, or that there's more and more conferences coming out, but the resistance is unbelievable in my experience.
I have not done this before. I'm used to speaking to 12 people about one specific person and one specific exposure. So I apologize if I stammered a little bit today. I would love to do this again. I have volunteered to speak to people, mostly the people that I work with, those that worked in shipyards, pipe fitters, insulators, from back in the days of heavy use of asbestos, but I have not ever spoken on this, and I'm available, I guess.
Those people that know me, of course, think that I talk about it too much. I would like to say, just in response to your query about firefighters, police, etc., we invited all of the local people from the firefighting, first responder types, EMTs. We actually sent out formal invitations to firefighters and all the rest. Are there any here? Are there any firefighters here or first responder people? Then maybe, sort of. I guess they didn't come. So we actually did reach out to that community specifically. So we should all try. Yes, well, there's no question. We should all try. Yeah, right here and then here.
Yeah. Was the dust tested for radioactivity or chemically analyzed for uranium or other byproducts of thermonuclear degeneration?
With respect to radioactivity, what I heard was that it was tested with inadequate instruments. They, you know, so it was another one of those, okay, it's fine. But that was a government agency, and you can't count on it.
Is there any evidence of aerosolized trace elements of the putative explosives like thermite or RDX? Is that anybody come out?
Well, I think you should attend Dr. Jones's lecture this afternoon. The whole lecture centers around that. I mean, you'll get a very detailed understanding of what's in the dust.
But Nate doesn't know of any trace elements besides those you mentioned of something that would indicate explosives.
Do I know of them? Sure. I was asked to speak about asbestos, so I just focused on that. I know there were, and again, I will defer to Dr. Jones too.
Next, somebody from the back there. Yes, there, all the way in the back.
First of all, you have the House bill number for the compensation due. Secondly, I did talk to a group of firemen on April 18th, the 100th anniversary of the quake. I just happened to remember there were firemen all over San Francisco that day, and they were running this group, and they hadn't heard of Building 7, and the reason the building fell constantly. So that was what they
Yeah, that's unfortunate, which is... Right, I think, yeah, and well, Jeanette, made the commentary. A lot of people don't feel comfortable talking about those things. The Senate bill was S-852, right? The Senate bill for the FAIR Act, which is really the Unfair Act, that's what the Senate bill is. And what's the House bill? What's the representative to connect? Maloney? From?
The one you were talking about. Well, there's one bill by Maloney and the other by Nadler.
Yes, another in the back. Yeah.
I understand that there was a court order or something like that requiring asbestos removal from the World Trade Center building when Silverstein purchased it. Do you know anything about that?
The Port Authority had been attempting to clean up the asbestos for quite some time. The buildings were, of course, very large, and the amount of asbestos in there was massive. I imagine you could find documented proof that some of the asbestos has been taken out, but there is plenty of documented proof that a lot of it remained. Does that answer the question? Or is that an evasive lawyer answer?
No, they weren't that inept before. That was part of the focus of the speech, was that 9/11 was intended to set a new precedent. Before 9/11, they would do the right thing. They would test in concentric circles. With 9/11, they just decided, 9/11 exposes people to a 1 in 10,000 cancer risk among the residents. That's what their cleanup standard was. Prior to that, it was a 1 in a million cancer risk. So the residents of Lower Manhattan are getting exposed to 100 times as much contamination, and you're going to see exactly the same thing when a dirty bomb hits. It's going to be 100 times as much radiation as before.
Out here in Richmond, in response to the inadequate sampling of contaminants by Shell Oil and by the county, the citizens organized scientifically valid methods of sampling air and having it tested. Was there any kind of an organized response in New York to have citizens take samples in a systematic way and have them tested by third parties?
There was a hell of a lot of response among individual citizens to get themselves independent testing, and that's been extremely valuable because that data has been brought up in scientific panels. It's the citizens, really, who've been coming and exposing the truth downtown. I don't know what you mean by organized. Did people pool their money together? Not a whole lot, a little bit.
Everybody seems to be citing EPA data, and we know that that's false and inadequate. And I was wondering if there's a good, solid basis of, database of information out there.
Yeah, there's a lot of independent data, and we've been trying to make it public, and we tried to make it public at scientific panels. EPA, of course, fights that. And then there are whistleblower scientists, and I would strongly recommend that you Google what Kate Jenkins has written about this, and also Dr. Marjorie Clark, two independent scientists who've testified. Dr. Clark has testified. Dr. Jenkins has written hundreds of pages of memos. She's within EPA. Those are the two I would refer you to.
We have time here for a couple more questions. Are there any women in the room that have questions? Yes, right here. Can you try to speak up? Thanks.
In the light of 9/11, is asbestos still used in the building industry to the extent that it was
I'm going to sound like I'm blowing my own horn, but obviously I'm too young for this. I'm only 35. But due in large part to lawsuits from personal injury lawyers, the truth about asbestos and how it causes disease came to light. You have to mention a gentleman by the name of Dr. Irving Selikoff from New York. He was very instrumental in bringing to light the true consequences of working with asbestos. But because basically the fear of lawsuits, most companies do not use them anymore. Most things like drywall joint compounds removed asbestos as a component part in the late 1970s. You can still find it in some brakes in automobiles and clutches and things of that nature. I did the tourist thing in Alcatraz yesterday and noticed that the ceiling tiles in the dining hall in Alcatraz were asbestos. Yeah, and it has not been banned. It's legal for people to use it. Hopefully, people like me can convince them not to use it.
We have time for a couple more questions here. Over, your hand was up early.
Questions for today? Welcome. You mentioned that dust in your apartment. Was it warm in temperature?
Yes, I think, I actually can't remember. I was so stunned. I mean, we were just, the only thing I remember is being lucky to be alive. I mean, and the other thing, which has not so much to do with the dust, it actually deafened us. The sound literally deafened us. And what I remember after the collapse is total silence because we were deaf. In terms of the dust being warm, I was just in a daze, really. I was lucky that I was functioning enough to even be able to get the wet towel because it really was your life just in an instant. Day was night, and it was a nightmare to even, just keep breathing. Every breath that I took, we didn't think we could even make it to the front door because whenever or even to get the towel for anything. Every time you breathed in, you thought you were going to die. You didn't want to breathe because I thought the dust was going to kill me right on the spot. I just thought, am I going to drop dead in the hallway? So I can't really say that it was warm. I mean, that never even crossed my mind. That's not one of my memories, but it certainly was a horrific experience. Yeah, okay.
I perceive as a non-New Yorker that most people in New York are somewhat skeptical about pronouncements and authorities and so forth. And I also know that New York, of course, is a great center of journalistic activity with publications like the Village Voice and reporters like Cy Hirsch. And so I guess the combination of that skepticism that seems to be in the New York ethos combined with the high-powered journalists that are operating in the city, I'm a little puzzled as to why there have not been journalistic exposés of a scandal of this magnitude.
I think that's the mindset that one does see, and I think I felt that way before too. I mean, I was brought up as a knee-jerk Democrat. If you voted Republican, God would chop off your right arm. And, that's as far as it went. And the New York Times was the newspaper of record. And it takes a while. I think it's only after 9/11 that people have understood that maybe it's not like that. I mean, we thought 60 Minutes was liberal. Well, the world has changed an enormous amount in 30 years. And only after 9/11 do you really start to notice it, and only if you're deeply immersed in this issue. So most people, and I totally get where you're coming from. New York prides itself on being the most, liberal city off the coast of Europe and emancipated and so forth, but they're really not, because the way in which they're liberal is they're not in the vanguard. Everybody's looking around to see where is the critical mass. I don't want to be the one standing out. I don't want to be the kid, the nutcase. And the way the New York Times has portrayed 9/11 truth across the board is as a bunch of, lunatics. So they'll describe a conference and they'll talk about professors, and on the other hand, they'll talk about colorful characters. It's much more fun to portray this kind of movement as a circus and focus on the eccentricities rather than on the hard science, which is not fun. It's not even particularly interesting, actually. No, no offense, but it's really hard. And people just want to hear that these are the lunatics and they're interested in explosions and no plane and crazy stuff. And so it's a question of being in school and saying those are the cool, that's the cool crowd, this is what the cool people believe, and this is what the nutcases believe.
So we have about 5 minutes left, so we need a couple. We had one gentleman here, and we had one here, and then we'll finish right here with the gentleman in the vest and the hat. So 3 more. We have you. Go ahead. And then over here, we have, did you ask a question already? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Yes, you're next, and then the last will be here, and then we'll be out of time. Go ahead.
As to the asbestos, I understand that when Mr. Silverstein and his investment group leased the Twin Towers in July of 2001, it was projected that in order to bring the buildings up to code, in order to get rid of the asbestos, it was going to cost $800 million, and to bring them up to total code, $2 billion. So he evaded that by the convenience of the attack, and also collected $4 billion in insurance.
That I believe he bought 6 weeks before the collapse, but that's another conspiracy theory. An alternative to removing asbestos in a lot of buildings is painting over it, encapsulating it. But of course, when a building, I'm sorry, I'm gesturing. When a building falls like that, the encapsulation does nothing. Everything's pulverized, it becomes friable, and it's in the air. I use terms like these every day, so I apologize, assuming everybody knows. A common form of asbestos used back in the days was pipe insulation. It's a hard piece of insulation that you might mistake for chalk. It's a little thicker. In that form, it's not friable. It's solid. There's no dust coming off of it. It can't hurt you. But when it becomes crumbly, when you can see dust coming off of it, it's friable. That's when it gets in your lungs. That's when it causes disease.
Is there a current estimate for the number of people now suffering health problems from the air contaminants from
Certain things are known and certain things have not yet been studied. The things that are known are the percent of Ground Zero workers who attended Mount Sinai and got screened, and oh God, what was it? It was, I think, 60% were suffering health effects following 9/11. But those are the people, the Ground Zero workers. Now, among residents, you don't have the same, degree of scrutiny, and certainly among the population of Stuyvesant high school students, there's nothing, because they weren't unionized. There were studies done of the faculty and staff in '02. About 60% reported health effects after 9/11, and half of those still had them in May of '02. But those people were grown-ups, and you could study them, but it's not been done with the students. And ironically, when we would bring up with the Board of Education the 6 students, the Board of Education would say, well, these are just anecdotal. And we would say, yeah, we know. We wish you'd do a study. Otherwise, that we could give you statistics. But as it is, all we have to go on is anecdotal evidence.
I just want to say that, you could measure some of the lung function, some of those tests. The psychological damage done to the people that experience this is literally beyond measure. There's no way you can measure the post-traumatic stress. And when you're in New York, the number of people that are still suffering, it's like the people that are being killed in Iraq. It's like we're not even counted. What really happened to the survivors is not even on the books. But it's just beyond measure. I don't know, there's nothing you can say about it except beyond measure.
the Mount Sinai study is about, what, 17,000 pages? It's pretty long. Well, it's a pretty long study. You can check it out online, actually. And there's a couple of other websites. Obviously, Jenna's website, WTCEO.org, and another 911EA.org. That's another really good site to check out for more of that information. Last question.
A couple of days after 9/11, he told me that people who had bought that building were having trouble with their insurance because they had $2 billion abatement program in place.
Can you speak up?
And I've worked with asbestos abatement, and when you actually put a saw to it, it rises up in cloud. It looks like smoke. And I had the pleasure of showing the officials, hey, we've been taking care of this, the smoke rose, and they also took a step back. Here. And
Anytime you can see dust like that that has asbestos in it, it's at an extremely dangerous level. As I said before, we could have a cloud of asbestos around our head right now at a dangerous level, and you wouldn't be able to see it. The fibers are so small.
If anybody's interested in sticking around here and speaking with any of the presenters, please feel free to do so. We need to adjourn at this point for our lunch break. I would briefly like to reiterate to you the rest of the day's schedule. We're going to adjourn for lunch right now. It's now noon. By the way, the clock on the back wall is an hour off. So it is now noon. There are plenty of places to go and get lunch right down on Shattuck Avenue.